and then we will take questions. There is a Q&A button on your screen, so feel free to submit questions throughout Ben's conversation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Dr. Benjamin M. Horton is a 2012 graduate of Saint Anselm College and returned to the college in 2014 as Assistant Director of the Academic Resource Center and an instructor in the Conversatio program. He holds a Master of Education degree from the University of Notre Dame, where he served as an ACE teaching fellow, and holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of New Hampshire in Higher Education Leadership and Policy. Dr. Horton has previously been awarded the ACCU's Irish American Scholars Fellowship, the NHCUC's President's Good Steward Award, the St. Anselm Athletic Department's Hawksore Hire Award, and the New Hampshire Union Leaders 40 Under 40 Award. Dr. Horton and his wife, Alex Puglisi, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Horton, from the class of 2011, met during their time on campus and were married in the Abbey Church in 2015. His academic research interests include student development, collaborative approaches to student support services and retention, academic advising, education policy, diversity, inclusion, and equity in education, and coeducation. And now I feel very, very overwhelmed by that. So now I'll turn it over to Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Patrice. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. All right. Well, thank you all for being with me today. As Patrice mentioned, my name is Ben Horton, and I'll talk in the beginning a little bit about who I am, what I am, and hopefully what I am not. So let me start by saying I'm a higher ed scholar. I study the administrative structures, the legal implications of higher education, and the impacts on students. For the purposes of this presentation, I think it's worth noting that I'm not a gender studies scholar, though my work on this project does have some overlap. This project, and I think I have it behind me here, so this project was actually part of my doctoral dissertation. You can see it here, entitled Perspectives on Change, the Coeducational Transition of Saint Anselm College 1969 to 1979. And so I'm really excited to be with you today to talk about my research interests and a little bit about the history of our wonderful college. I want to issue perhaps a little bit of a trigger warning here. And I want to let you know that some of the topics of which I'm going to address today might be a little bit surprising to you. I think everybody can see this on the screen. This came from the campus crier, which many of you are familiar. I have a copy here from 1975. And it says, jobs in the pub are not distributed along the usual pattern of certain tasks for guys, others for girls. On a given evening, you're likely to find an attractive young lady tending the bar. Sort of an interesting, thing to have in a campus newspaper, certainly something we would never see today. And I think it's worth having these conversations to kind of talk about those changes over time. But I think there is some shock value to this presentation. And part of that shock value can help us to understand the history of women on campus, perhaps to help us to consider who some of the outsiders may be today, and certainly to consider the progress of women at Saint Anselm, but also the work that we still have to do, not only at Saint Anselm, but across the field of higher education. So as I get started here, and I'm just waiting for my slide to load here. So I'm gonna give a little bit of a history of coeducation in American higher ed. So as many of you know, American higher ed originates with the early seminaries of the United States. And most of these seminaries, including places that you know, like Harvard and Yale, originated as places where males were trained for religious seminary to become preachers, particularly Protestant preachers. The early female academies, the early female seminaries were most prevalent in the North, and particularly in the Northeast. The Hartford Female Seminary, Mount Holyoke, Ipswich. And later on, there's sort of this establishment of more full-fledged colleges and universities as women's only institutions. Well, women were able to eventually study at public land-grant institutions, places like the University of New Hampshire. Their participation in college life was often far from equal. They were regularly segregated, systematically tracked once inside the walls of American colleges and universities, discouraged from entering certain fields and directed to pursue others. Historically, as you may know, teaching and nursing and those sorts of fields were sort of seen as women's only professions. Let me just wait for this to load for a second. Oh, and one area in which women participated in the curriculum of colleges and universities to a much greater extent was in the development and the proliferation, of the normal schools. The normal school movement came in response to the idea of the compulsory public education. And these normal schools served as really the early rudimentary teacher training colleges across the United States. They often gave a certificate or a license rather than a baccalaureate degree. Let's see here. And the normal schools came in response to what was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. This was a 1647 law passed in Massachusetts, and it stated that the Old Deluder Satan, one of the chief objectives of the devil, was to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures. And so this act is going to allow, or actually require, towns of 50 or more families to select a reading and writing teacher who's going to educate the children of Massachusetts towns throughout the state. And this is really going to give rise to what we call sort of the common school movement and eventually the normal schools in the United States. So that's some of the early history, I think, of women in higher education. In 1884, and I'm just going to give you a few quick examples here. I know I don't have too much time, but 1884, the principal or the president of McGill University in Montreal, Principal William Dawson, commented that women were splendid, sensitive creatures who do not need or deserve the same education as men. Again, in 1908, Wisconsin's President Van Hise, argued for a natural segregation of the sexes at colleges and universities. He claimed that women would never choose to be educated in fields like law, engineering, business, or agriculture, and that instead that they'd choose other professions that were more suitable for women. So this is just some of the history of the discrimination, I think, that women face nationwide in higher ed. A little bit about breaking the barrier. So Yale's going to welcome its first class of female students in 1969. They received a total of 2,850 applications from women for 240 spots. Cornell goes co-ed in 1983, Columbia in 1987, which is just shocking. University of Virginia, 1974, the U.S. Military Academy's 1975. There were 4 million women in higher ed in 1970, compared to 18 million today. And today, 57% of baccalaureate degrees in the United States are earned by women. So I think some interesting statistics as we think about women entering the field of higher education. A few notable cases. Middlebury College was an all-male institution from 1800 to 1883. And the local townspeople of Middlebury, Vermont, are actually going to petition the college to experiment with allowing female students for a year. So this is really comes from like a grassroots movement. The college agreed, admitting 6 women in 1883. And by 1902, women made up 40% of the student body at Middlebury. So I think that's an example of really how women wanted this experience, and how colleges adapted nationwide, not sort of across the board, but there's this slow and steady admission of women into American higher ed. The University of Rochester, many of you are familiar with Susan B. Anthony, and the University of Rochester is well noted for succumbing to pressure from Susan B. Anthony and other feminists. And they experimented with a coeducational movement beginning in 1900. Anthony and her fellow activists even raised the funds, because funding was an issue at the time. And they actually passed a rule at the university that they were able to transition to coeducation. Almost overnight, the university determined that the admission of women was a failed experiment, and without giving any sort of reason, they returned to their previously all-male status by 1912. So there are some universities, there's some precedent for universities sort of failing to go co-ed the first try as well. So I want to talk a little bit about my study. My study, as I mentioned, was part of my doctoral dissertation research. And I'll dive into that a little bit right here. So I think it's worth noting that at this time in the United States, there's a lot going on. My study focuses on the years 1969. For those of you who may have lived on campus, you know, you're familiar with Joan of Arc and with Gadbois Hall, the nursing, what was called the nursing dorm and the nursing building. Those were both built in 1969. So 1969 is a significant year in sort of college history, as the college really transitioned to residential nursing students. But I think prior to that, there's a lot going on with regard to certainly Vatican II, with regard to the Land O'Lakes Conference, the discussion around the emerging role of women in the Catholic Church and in Catholic higher education. Vatican II, as you may know, 23 women were permitted to serve as auditors of Vatican II. They weren't really active participants, but they were allowed to audit Vatican II. So there's a lot of sort of changes that are going on at this time, and Saint Anselm really is going to transition to coeducation right in the middle of a very tumultuous time in American higher education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Saint Anselm College was the first Benedictine college in the world to go co-ed. We often think about ourselves as being slow to change as a Benedictine institution, but certainly the first Benedictine college in the world to go co-ed. We were the last Catholic men's college in New England to transition to coeducation. And I think part of that has to do with the unique governance and decision-making structure at the time. And, you know, I really had interest in this project because Saint Anselm was both my alma mater, my employer, I have a great personal interest in Saint Anselm. So my research study focused on 3 questions. What factors influence the Saint Anselm to transition to coeducation? What was the campus climate or campus ethos like? And then what were the significant impacts of the college's transition? And specifically on students. I looked at 2 different sources of information. I looked at the Geisel Library archives, and then I also looked at the Saint Anselm Abbey archives, the monastic archives, which really in some ways are like the family records of the monastery. So some really interesting information. These archives provided access to the presidential files, the notes of the president, the minutes of the monastic meetings, registrars and dean's office data, advancement data, NHCUC data, and you know, correspondence between the college administrators and folks across the diocese and across the state. But why aren't the archives enough? You can see here this brief passage, and it says, Father Brendan, OSB, president of the college, made public on November 14th the decision of St. Anselm's College to admit women commuting students to all of its educational programs, beginning with the college, with the coming fall semester. Very little information, very little detail there. So to actually know what's going on kind of behind the scenes is a really interesting endeavor, and that's what I set out to do. So I also launched an oral history component of this study to provide context, but also to give voice to the college's first women, to preserve their stories, and to add to the archival information available. So this would really provide details regarding the campus climate, the campus ethos during this era. I interviewed 10 female alumni from 1969 to 1979. I did a 10 to 15 minute telephone interview and then a 1-hour on-campus recorded interview. And I interviewed a variety of alumni from commuters to on-campus residents, infirmary nurses, liberal arts students, nursing students, some of the first residents of Joan of Arc, the first residents of St. Mary's, some athletes, etc. I used an oral history implementation, and I'll just mention this very quickly, from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. They transitioned to coeducation in 1970. And if you're interested in coeducation in the United States, there are some great resources on Lafayette's website, including photo gallery, oral histories, etc. So I actually use some of their instrumentation as my sort of background as I look to pursue this project. These are some of the research questions, really about why women decided to attend the college, some of the challenges, did they feel like they were part of campus life, you know, and then anything else really that they wanted to share about their experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but mostly good. And I think this project really set out to give voice to a lot of the women on campus. There are very, very few oral histories that exist globally involving coeducation. And so Lafayette and Baylor both have very strong oral history programs. But otherwise, you know, Saint Anselm, you know, in this sense, to have a repository of women's voices really is pretty groundbreaking work. And to have the combination of the archival analysis and the oral history methods, I think is really important as well. So this research, as I mentioned, there's a lot of gaps in this area, and certainly I think it's really critical to preserve these perspectives long term for the college. So there were some challenges to the research, particularly in terms of separation of time, right? We're talking about folks who were in school in the 70s, in the 60s. So sometimes remembering the exact details of things, you know, as an oral historian, not prompting them was a challenge at points, but I think, you know, I've listed here a few of the challenges to the research. So let me start I'm wrapping up, Patrice, don't worry. But let me start here by talking a little bit about the unique governance structure of the college and some of the challenges to coeducation. So the Benedictines, as you know, the oldest religious order in Western civilization. They live according to the rule of Saint Benedict, 529 AD. They take vows of obedience, stability, and conversatio morum. We really have, at the time, these two very independent but dependent entities, the monastery and the college. The college's governance structure at the time, the Board of Trustees, were mostly, I actually have an article here about folks being appointed to the lay board, but they were mostly like friends of the monks, successful business people, and the monks by and large kind of listened to what the board had to say, but they had no real governing power. So the monastic chapter, particularly the Council of Seniors at the time, had really this governing power over the college. I've mapped out here a little bit about the abbot, the president, the Council of Seniors, the faculty, etc. So you can kind of get a sense of the hierarchy here, because it is in some ways a much different hierarchy than today. And I think we have to look at, you know, when any administrative decision is made in higher education, I think it must first sort of traverse the governing structure of the institution. So it's important to kind of understand that. The little blurb here, the purpose of the lay board of trustees shall be to provide advice and guidance in the conduct of the affairs of the college. So a brief sort of history of coeducation at the college. as I mentioned, 1969, the nursing dorm opens, Joan of Arc Hall. What had happened is in 1949, many nurses came back from World War II. And these nurses, by and large, had very excellent credentials in terms of having taken care of soldiers in battlefield situations, but they had no actual credentials in terms of a degree or anything like that. So a few colleges throughout the state got together because they had the lab facilities to be able to educate these nurses primarily at night to be able to get a nursing certificate. Prior to the opening of the nursing dorm, Joan of Arc, the nurses primarily lived at Notre Dame Hospital, which is now Catholic Medical Center, and as well as in another facility downtown in Manchester. I saw where I had a couple of comments here. Okay. Manchester at the time had, At the time, Manchester had the neighboring Catholic women's colleges, Notre Dame College in Manchester, Mount St. Mary's College in Hooksett, and then certainly Riviere in Nashua, which still exists. But there was some consideration at the time as to how Saint Anselm transitioning to co-ed might influence these other institutions. This is a piece from the files of the president, Father Brendan, at the time, and it's really interesting. It talks about innovative admission processes for the liberal arts college, and it says, caught between an inflating economy and increasing tuition, between the draft and compensatory education, between student involvement and campus violence, the private liberal arts college has few prospects of gaining large numbers of students. So you can really look at the dire situation that many institutions found themselves at in this area of the 1970s. So there were some primary arguments in favor of coeducation. The decline in enrollment at Saint Anselm, certainly some financial issues, the need to grow the liberal arts program, the desire to grow the liberal arts program, improving the quality of prospective student applications, certainly equality and hospitality, and then this idea that all the other Catholic men's colleges in New England have gone co-ed. So, this is from our own campus crier. They talk about the changing role of women in society, in education and in the church. As I mentioned, those being this era being a really interesting, time in the Catholic Church and in higher education. In terms of primary arguments against coeducation, certainly a modification of services. We would have to have different residence facilities, etc. Student populations versus available space and infrastructure. Religious vocations to the monastery. People thought that if there were women on campus, then men wouldn't want to be monks. The availability of the faculty, certainly to have more women in the faculty. There were considerations regarding morality and intervisitation. And then, again, those implications for those other Catholic women's colleges, Mount St. Mary's and Notre Dame and Riviere. there's actually a letter from Father Brendan to the other presidents of the women's colleges, and they just say, please don't transition to coeducation. And that was certainly a consideration for a long time. Ultimately, St. Anselm moved forward, and 2 of those colleges have since closed. So Friday, November 2nd, 1973 was sort of the day of the big vote. Abbot Joseph asked members of the monastic community to indicate their mind on the following 3 questions. Do you favor St. Anselm accepting women commuter students for the liberal arts? Oops, I'm sorry about that. Do you favor St. Anselm accepting women commuter and boarding students to the liberal arts? And regardless of personal position, do you judge the matter of such urgency that it should be discussed by our community at this time? So the monks went to a vote. And here's sort of the timeline of events. June 1973, the lay board discusses the possibility of potentially allowing female commuter students. October 1973, the Council of Seniors discussed the coeducation issue. October 73, Father Brendan approached the administrators from the neighboring women's colleges. November 73, the entire monastic chapter voted. November, the abbot informed the lay board of the vote. Winter of that year, the announcement is made. And then in June, sort of out of the blue, the lay board took another straw vote and said that the college should admit residential women outside of nursing. So August 1974, women are fully admitted to the liberal arts as commuters and resident students. This is really interesting. So what about the faculty? We talk a lot today about shared governance. And what about the faculty? Well, in the minutes of a faculty senate meeting dated December 11th, 1973, Bill Farrell, faculty senate president, discussed his disapproval that the administration had made the announcement of a coeducation policy without proper faculty conversation. He felt that the monastic community had not properly consulted the faculty at the time. So there was even some tension there between the faculty and the administration, particularly lay faculty. Not that he necessarily disagreed with the decision, but there was disagreement with regard to the process. So the college finally announced that it was going co-ed, and here's the announcement. Raggedy Ann and Andy. So this is winter 73, 74, and here's the announcement. Liberal arts programs now co-ed, both for day students and residents. That may be a little bit shocking to you to see that announcement. Here's some other campus publications. So another innovation of the Dart Inn, that's what they used to call the pub, the Hearth and Dart Inn, is that all of the various tasks of running the club are distributed among the staff members without designating certain jobs for guys and others for girls. On a given night, the person checking IDs at the door may be a diminutive young lady with another girl behind the bar while a man is tending the cashier's station. Having female bouncers is an idea that has worked out well. A soft voice in a subtle manner is sure to solve problems, when they arise. So just some interesting Campus Crier articles. 1975, the college institutes Buy a Girl, which was a program where you could buy a girl or rent a girl to do your laundry, cook you meals, etc. This is a fundraiser for athletic programs at the time. So that's 1975. But I want to stress here that there's also a real focus, I think, on how to make people feel welcome and how to make people feel part of the community. So here's a childcare babysitting service. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's see. Here's a childcare, a babysitting service that existed for mothers to use free of charge. So there was really some thought, some forward thinking into how do we recruit women to campus, and how do we make them feel comfortable and welcome here. The studio, here's another article. Residents of the studio have traditionally been a rather salty crew, valuing the degree of difference and independence that always seemed to characterize those who sought its homely refuge. And, you know, they talk about brewing beer in the bathtub, shooting at pheasants from the upstairs window. So the studio, Raphael Hall, was always a men's dorm and was known to kind of be a bit rough around the edges. As this particular Crier article announces, from 1975, the studio Make Way, the Crystal Palace is coming. And it was converted to a women's dormitory, much to the chagrin of the pheasant shooters and bathtub brewers. Again, an interesting St. Mary's article here. So St. Mary's, of course, across the street from the college, and the convent dormitory. It was a priory for the Benedictine sisters. You can see here the article. The cost of this new facility is $300,000 for a convent and a dormitory. Certainly the nursing pinning, a long held tradition on campus, these nurses earning their professional ranks, a tradition which we still have today. 1976, women in athletics and tennis became one of the first women's sports. There was a fair amount of discussion. Ted Palaskis, who was the athletic director at the time, went around to the women's dormitories and said, what sports would you like to play? And so tennis was one of our first sports for women, followed by basketball, volleyball, and some other sort of intramural opportunities. I think it's sort of, you know, and maybe I can stop screen sharing. Is that possible? Can you see me still? All right. So I think it's worth, you know, talking about this particular era in the college's history. We often think about how to make the college a more welcoming, more sort of community-centered place for our students, and this is work that we do every day here on campus. And I think looking at this era of history and really how welcome the college worked to make women feel on campus, despite the fact that it was in some ways a very different time, and certainly there were some different perspectives. You can imagine that in the 1960s, there were still monks in the abbey who had lived at the college since they were 10, 12, or 13 years old, who said, what are you doing bringing women to campus? And so it is, now we kind of look back on it and we say like, oh, it's a no-brainer. The college was maybe in some financial trouble, enrollment was declining, the world was changing, women were getting more voice and more say, and so why wouldn't they have transitioned? But really, this was, in some ways, a very progressive move and a very forward-thinking move for the college. And I think certainly some amazing efforts were made on the part of the administration, certainly the dean of students and the monastic community at the time, in order to make women feel comfortable and safe and welcome, including, Father Jonathan recommending women counselors in the residence halls, having women proctors, certainly, as I mentioned, Ted Palaskis, the athletic director, instituting sports for women. All of those things were sort of very forward thinking at the time. And then I'll say that there were some things that maybe were not forward thinking. I often chuckle about a letter that I found from Father Jude, for those of you who remember Father Jude, to Sister Novelle. And the letter says, "Dear Sister, in light of this new Title IX legislation, I've determined that we can no longer lock men into or we can no longer lock the women into Joan of Arc at night, because if we lock the women into Joan of Arc at night, we also have to lock the men into Dominic, and the boys in Dominic would never go for it if they had to be locked in at night. So we're gonna just sort of open the doors and let people run free, so to speak. But it was a different time. There was this really sort of protective in loco parentis type of attitude towards, certainly towards morality, towards how do we keep people safe, how do we keep people feeling comfortable. So a really interesting time. And I think I'll leave it at that. I've sort of gone beyond my time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have at this point.
Thank you, Ben. That was very interesting. We do have a few questions, and if anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button and we'll get those answered for you. So one person has written, "I'm curious what might have led to the shift where now more women receive degrees than men?"
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a number of there's a number of answers. Number one, I think, is sort of a less maybe a less maybe I won't go on record saying it, but oftentimes, and this was something that was found at Yale and at a few other places, that oftentimes women coming out of high school were more qualified applicants than men in terms of SAT scores and other achievements. I think that there are a lot of examples of colleges investing in programs for women, in programs to recruit women. Certainly a lot of sort of an influx in majors like gender studies, and those types of things that are really, I think, in many ways designed to invite more women. And, you know, I would say that overall, societally, there's been a change in attitude where, you know, in the early 1900s, there was a lot of discussion about how women's best education, and these are not my words, these are sort of a societal view that women's best education in the early 1900s was achieved through courtship to a man. That women's role was in the home. And I think those sort of shifts, and I think there's a lot of shifts around certainly like radical feminism and those types of things, that changed people's perspectives, or at least shifted the conversation and made attending college a lot more welcoming for women. I think the other thing that happened is men, by and large, women, as I mentioned, women were much more likely at the time to become teachers and nurses. And we saw a lot of need at the time for qualified, as states sort of ramped up their credentialing processes, etc. And men in the 70s and in the 60s sort of went into law and business at higher rates. Women went into education and nursing at higher rates, and nursing and education became sort of more professionalized. So there was a lot more sort of interest from women in those fields. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of, that's a great question.
Okay, another question is, did you speak with monks who were here in the 60s and 70s, and particularly those who left the monastery?
So that's interesting. I certainly have spoken with many of them. I've not spoken as much with those who have left the monastery, though I am familiar with a few situations. But I think, you know, the perspectives of the monks is really interesting. The college went through a lot of changes during this time, and I think no one knows better, I think, than the people who have dedicated their lives to the place. My study, this particular study, was focused really on preserving the perspectives of the women, the early students of the college. So the monks were not as much of my focus, just because I really, you know, as I mentioned, many of the women who I interviewed are in their 60s and 70s, and for some of them older. So it's I think important at this period of time to preserve those perspectives and to really have a repository of those perspectives. But I would love to follow it up with some discussions with the monastic community, certainly.
And just to follow up on that, another question is, through the oral histories that you had, what were the biggest challenges that alumna faced their first years on campus?
That's a great question. So, I mean, it really depends on what era you're talking. There were times in the college's history when, like I mentioned, women were living down at Notre Dame Hospital. If anyone knows where CMC is today, they were literally walking up the hill from CMC to school every day. When they were down at the Carpenter Center downtown, right? Women were literally getting driven up or bused up onto campus. So you can imagine that feeling of being sort of driven to campus and sort of plopped at a place with 1,200 guys when you're one of, you know, a few women taking classes. So I talked to some folks who were the only women in some of their classes. One particular, one of my oral history folks, participants, was the daughter of a faculty member. So nieces of the monks and daughters of faculty members were allowed to attend the college sort of prior to the official transition to coeducation. So to hear her talk about being literally the only woman in her classes, and just, you know, what that felt like, I think was interesting. I think, you know, in terms of the other considerations, I think there were efforts made, considerable efforts, certainly by Father Jonathan and others, to, you know, make the women feel welcome in their residence halls. So like decorating committees to decorate the residence halls and those sorts of things. But I mean, there was a time at which women were not allowed to eat in the dining hall on campus. And you know, the sort of unofficial rumor is that the men didn't want to clean up their behavior in the dining hall, so they voted that women were not allowed to eat on campus. But you can imagine that was certainly like I said, it was a different time. It was a different time.
Yes, times have certainly changed. One question we have is, what is intervisitation like now?
Awesome
Doors are
question.
still unlocked.
Yeah, great. So in 1974, I believe, a parietals rally was the second largest student government expenditure behind Parents' Weekend. So a parietals rally, literally a rally protesting parietals. Parietals, of course, were, you know, men's dorms and women's dorms without intervisitation. I think the spring weekend and maybe the fall weekend were the two exceptions, but they were fairly strict in terms of whether men or women could enter one another's residences. Today, so we still have some residences on campus, many residences on campus that are single sex, we might say. Certainly places like Dominic, Joan of Arc, still a male residence hall or a female residence hall. But I think there's been, in some ways, some loosening of the policy, just in terms of, you know, allowing, certainly like on the weekends until I think midnight, you know, there's intervisitation. And I think most days now there's intervisitation till either midnight or, you know, around midnight. I think the bigger question now is really about anyone going into any other residence hall. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has caused the college to restrict in some ways who can go into what residence hall. But I think we've certainly seen a loosening of the policy since the 70s.
Okay, we have one more question, a few comments that I'll read. So the final question is, were men allowed to study nursing at the beginning of the residential nursing program in 1969, or was it women's only?
So that's great. So I'm not aware of any male nursing majors in the 60s. However, I did find an article from the early 70s. There were, I think, 3 or 4 men who were like a team of male nurses, they called themselves, or at least the article called them. I don't think there was ever a, you know, men can do this or they can't do that. I think it was just sort of based on their own desire. I will say even the college seemed even pretty flexible prior to this, to allow women to campus who may have been, you know, as I said, nieces of the monks or daughters of the faculty members. So I can think of one example where a woman from a local woman from right down here simply walked up the hill and walked into, at the time it was called the Administration Building at Alumni Hall, and just said, "I'd like to go to school here." And one of the monks said, "Okay, you know, we'll make it happen." And she was able to take some courses at the college. So I don't think there was ever sort of a, you know, you can't study nursing or you can't study, but it was certainly much more restrictive. And I don't think there was a lot of interest from men, particularly in the 60s. That would steadily increase, you know, throughout the 70s. But, you know, even if you look at that photo I showed at the end of the nursing program today, I would say largely, it is largely women dominated.
Okay, and then there's a couple of comments in the chat that I'm not sure if you can see. I think all the other panelists. But Patricia Edwards writes that she transferred from Notre Dame College in 1976 after her freshman year and had no idea that St. A's had just gone co-ed. So to her, it seemed that it had always been that way as a commuter. And as were many of her friends, but she felt totally part of the student life. Interesting though, as this may have explained professors' reactions to women. Also probably why the monks were horrified when the new Women's Guild of the Knights of Columbus named ourselves Ladies of the Knights with that double entendre. So,
thank you, Patricia. That's really interesting. And let me also say, Patricia, that you know, if you have stories and you have perspectives, you know, I am no longer working on the project. I have the book right here, but if you'd like to certainly have me, you know, interview you for the oral history repository in the Geisel Library archives, I'd be happy to schedule something. I can add my my email to the chat here. So if you're interested in talking more about the project, or you'd like me to send you either the you know, the email. Oh, I see Connie is here. Connie, thank you, Connie, for your contributions to the project as well. Connie's a member of the class of 1969. So I'd love to have more folks contribute their perspectives to this important project, and you know, I'm certainly appreciative to all those of you who have. So.
Yes, and another thank you to Marcy Cassidy, who suggested this topic because it's been a fascinating webinar. And I think that from there, I just wanted one final comment that was Father Jonathan joined us for this. Oh, he had to hop off a little earlier, but he said, "Great job, Ben. It was very interesting."
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and Father Jonathan, certainly a enormous contributor at the time to sort of the student life aspect of this transition, you know, in terms of keeping things particularly in the residence halls. He dealt with a lot. He dealt with a lot, and you know, certainly this was uncharted territory for him and for the college, and you know, for him and for Father Brendan, certainly Father Placidus, you know, some really interesting situations that arose at the time, and you know, we all as a college community, I think, should be grateful for their leadership and their you know, foresight in many ways, because it was a tremendous feat to do this, particularly without any sort of Benedictine sort of precedent for this. So.
We have one more comment from Bob Savard. As a male student from 67 to 71, diversity was Irish, Polish, Italian, French, Catholics, all white males. As males, we were not prepared for diversity in the workplace of society. Coeducation is vital toward the preparation of student for life after college.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think certainly that's true of the campus. I would say the majority, you know, Irish, Polish, Italian, and French Canadian. You know, I think that, yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think Gail Lynch, who I mentioned earlier, had mentioned that as well, that you know, she works for waste management, and she talked to me about how how different it was coming from sort of the St. A's bubble, as she called it, into the real world, and how she never really felt like there was any discrimination here. She felt like there was sort of almost a big brother type protective nature of the college at the time. But then certainly as she got out into the real world, she experienced, you know, a different attitude towards women in professional careers at the time. So.
Well, just to wrap up, I want to, on behalf of the Alumni Association, really want to thank you for taking the time, Ben. We really appreciate it. It was fascinating. I mentioned earlier that this is being recorded, and we will post it on our website once we get it all transitioned over. But really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, and I really appreciate it. And I did share my my email address with you all, so happy to talk more. My dissertation is also available online. If you type in Perspectives on Change and my last name, you'll be able to pull that up and to read it. And certainly happy to continue the conversation or to work with Keith to add any of your perspectives to those library archives. So thank you. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.